The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late September of 1882, and when Sarah Dawson opened it with trembling fingers, she already knew what words would greet her from the page before her eyes could focus on the physician's careful script. Her father was dying, and there was medicine that might help him hold on a little longer, but the cost was far beyond what their small ranch outside Gila Bend, Arizona, could afford. She sat at the worn kitchen table in their adobe house, the desert heat pressing through the thin walls, and she thought about what she had left to sell. The ranch had already been stripped bare. They had sold the cattle one by one over the past 2 years as her father's illness progressed, keeping back only enough animals to maintain the pretense that they were still ranchers rather than charity cases. The good horses were gone. Her mother's wedding ring had been pawned in town 6 months ago. Sarah looked around the sparse room and saw nothing of value except the wooden chairs her grandfather had made, and those would fetch maybe enough for a week's worth of food, nothing more. She walked to the small mirror hanging near the door and studied her reflection in the wavy glass. 20 years old, sun-bronzed skin, and hair that fell past her waist in thick waves the color of honey touched with fire. Her mother had always said it was her finest feature, the kind of hair women in the cities back east would pay money to have. Sarah reached up and gathered the heavy mass in both hands, feeling the weight of it, and made her decision before fear could change her mind. The next morning she rode into Gila Bend on their last remaining horse, a gentle mare named Bess who was too old to fetch a good price at auction. The town squatted in the desert like a collection of sun-bleached bones, false-fronted buildings lining a single main street where dust devils danced in the spaces between. Sarah had lived her whole life within 20 miles of this place, but she had never felt more like a stranger than she did riding down that street with her hair braided and coiled at the base of her neck, knowing what she was about to do. The general store belonged to a man named Henderson who also dealt in oddities and items for resale. Sarah had heard that he bought hair from women, though she had never imagined she would be one of them. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and Henderson looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man who had seen every kind of desperation the desert could produce. "Miss Dawson," he said, his tone neither kind nor unkind, "what brings you to town?" "I need to sell my hair," Sarah said, and she was proud that her voice did not shake. "All of it." Henderson studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Hair like yours, I can give you $40. It will go to a wig maker in San Francisco." $40 was more than she had hoped for, but less than the medicine cost. Still, it was a start. "I will take it," she said. Henderson led her to the back room where he kept a chair and his scissors. Sarah sat down and unpinned her braid, letting the heavy rope of hair fall down her back one last time. She closed her eyes as Henderson began to cut, feeling the strange lightness as lock after lock fell away. When he was finished, she ran her hand over her head and felt only the short crop that remained, barely an inch long all around. She looked like a boy, or like someone who had survived a terrible fever. Henderson paid her in coins and bills, counting them out carefully. Sarah folded the money into her pocket and walked back out into the fierce Arizona sunlight, feeling the heat on her bare neck for the first time in her life. Several people stared as she passed, and she kept her head high, refusing to show shame for what necessity had required. She rode directly to the doctor's office, a small building on the edge of town where Dr. Morrison kept his practice. The doctor was a tired-looking man in his 50s who had seen too much suffering and not enough healing. He listened as Sarah explained what she needed, and he shook his head with genuine regret. "The laudanum and the other medicines your father requires, Miss Dawson, They total $75 for a month's supply. What you have here will get you perhaps 2 weeks, maybe less." Sarah felt something inside her crack, but she refused to let it break completely. "Then give me 2 weeks' worth," she said. "I will find the rest." Dr. Morrison prepared the medicines and showed her how to administer them, writing careful instructions on a piece of paper. Sarah took the bottles and tucked them into her saddlebag with the same care she would give to precious jewels. She had perhaps $15 left from the hair money, and she had no idea where the next month's medicine would come from, but those were problems for tomorrow. The ride back to the ranch took her past the Turner spread, a much larger operation that ran cattle on several thousand acres of desert grassland. She had known the Turner family all her life, though they moved in different circles. Old Samuel Turner had died the previous spring, and his son had taken over the ranch. Peter Barrett had been Samuel's nephew, raised by the Turners after his own parents died in a cholera outbreak when he was 8 years old. He had taken his uncle's name for the inheritance, but kept his father's surname for pride, using both in the hybrid way of men who straddled 2 families. Sarah had not seen much of Peter since they had both been children attending the same one-room schoolhouse. He had grown into a tall man with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled at his collar, despite obvious attempts to keep it tamed. His face was all angles and shadows, with eyes the color of creek water over stones, and he had a reputation as a hard worker and a fair boss who paid his ranch hands on time. She did not expect to see him on the road that day, but as she guided Bess around a bend in the trail, there he was, sitting astride a big bay gelding and blocking her path. He had been examining something on the ground, tracking marks or checking for strays, but he looked up as she approached and his eyes widened. "Sarah," he said, as though he was not quite sure. "Sarah Dawson." She wanted to ride past without stopping, but good manners had been bred into her bones by parents who believed courtesy cost nothing. "Hello, Peter," she said, reaching up self-consciously to touch her shorn head before she could stop herself. He stared at her hair, or rather the absence of it, and she watched him work through the calculation of what it meant. She saw the moment understanding reached his eyes, followed by something that looked like pain on her behalf. "Your father," he said quietly. It was not a question. "The medicine is expensive," Sarah said, lifting her chin. "I did what I needed to do." Peter was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on his saddle horn. "I heard he was poorly. I should have come by, brought some supplies, or offered help. We have been neighbors a long time." "We do not need charity," Sarah said, and the words came out sharper than she intended. "I was not offering charity," Peter said mildly. "I was offering what neighbors do for each other out here. There is a difference." Sarah felt her face heat, though whether from anger or embarrassment she could not tell. "I need to get home," she said. "My father will be worried." "Of course," Peter said, and he moved his horse aside to let her pass, but as she rode by he called after her. "Sarah, if you need anything, anything at all, our door is open. I mean that." She did not answer, just touched her heels to Bess's sides and rode on. Behind her, she could feel Peter's eyes on her back, but she did not turn around. Her father was sleeping when she arrived home, his breathing shallow and labored. He looked smaller than he had just days before, as though the illness was consuming him from the inside out. Sarah prepared the first dose of medicine according to Dr. Morrison's instructions and sat by his bedside, waiting for him to wake. When his eyes finally opened, they were cloudy with pain but still sharp with awareness. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw his gaze move to her hair. His face crumpled and tears began to slide down his weathered cheeks. "Sarah, no," he whispered. "You should not have done that, not for me." "It is just hair," she said, taking his hand. "It will grow back. You are my father, and I would do anything to keep you here with me." "Your mother would have been so angry with me," he said, his voice breaking, "letting it come to this, leaving you alone with nothing." "You did your best," Sarah said firmly. "The drought, the cattle sickness, none of that was your fault. Now take your medicine and rest. We will figure out the rest as it comes." He took the medicine obediently, and within minutes he had drifted back to sleep, his breathing a little easier. Sarah sat with him until darkness fell, then made herself some simple supper and tried not to think about the future stretching ahead like an endless desert with no water in sight. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of nursing and worry. The medicine helped her father, enough that he could sit up in bed and eat a little food, enough that he smiled at her jokes and asked about the ranch. But Sarah knew it was temporary. The bottles were getting emptier each day, and she had no solution for what came next. She had sold everything she could sell. The furniture was worthless, the land was mortgaged, and there was nothing left. She lay awake at night trying to think of options, considering and discarding desperate ideas. She could try to find work in town, but who would care for her father? She could write to her mother's family back in Missouri, but they had made it clear years ago that they wanted nothing to do with a daughter who had married a rancher and moved to the territories. On the morning the medicine finally ran out, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands and allowed herself the luxury of 5 minutes of despair. Then she straightened her spine, wiped her eyes, and prepared to ride into town to beg Dr. Morrison for more time to pay. She was saddling Bess when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She turned to see Peter Barrett riding into her yard, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. He dismounted and walked toward her, pulling off his hat in a gesture of respect. "Morning, Sarah," he said. "Peter," she said warily, "what are you doing here?" "I was in town yesterday and I ran into Dr. Morrison," Peter said. "He mentioned your father's medicine had run out. I thought I would bring some supplies and I wanted to talk to you about something." Sarah felt her back stiffen. "I told you we do not need charity." "Good," Peter said, "because I am not offering any. I am offering you a job." That stopped her. "A job? My housekeeper quit last month to go live with her daughter in Tucson," Peter said. "I have been managing on my own, but the truth is I am a terrible cook and the house is becoming a disaster. I need someone to manage the household, cook for me and the hands, keep things running. It is a real job with real pay. $30 a month plus room and board." Sarah stared at him. $30 a month was more than fair wages for housekeeping, generous even. It was enough to buy her father's medicine and still have some left over. But it would mean leaving her father alone on the ranch, and she could not do that. Peter seemed to read her thoughts. "I was thinking your father could come too. I have a small cottage on the property, used to be where my uncle's foreman lived before he retired. It has 2 rooms and a good fireplace. Your father could stay there and you would be close by to care for him. Dr. Morrison could come out once a week to check on him. I would pay for that as part of your wages." It was too much, too convenient, and Sarah's pride reared up in defense. "Why would you do this?" she demanded. "We barely know each other." Peter was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "Do you remember when we were kids in school and there was that boy, Tommy Rhodes, who used to bully the smaller children?" Sarah frowned, trying to remember. "Vaguely. One day he stole my lunch, not because he was hungry but because he liked being mean," Peter said. "You saw it happen, and you marched right up to him even though he was twice your size, and you told him that stealing was wrong and he needed to give it back. When he laughed at you, you kicked him in the shins so hard he cried." Despite everything, Sarah felt a small smile tug at her mouth. "I remember that. I got in trouble for it." You stood up for what was right, even when it cost you something, Peter said. I have never forgotten that. You have been that person your whole life, Sarah. Now you sold your hair to take care of your father, and I respect that more than I can say. So I am offering you honest work for honest pay. Nothing more, nothing less. You would be doing me a favor, truly. Sarah looked at him, searching his face for any sign of pity or condescension, but she found only sincerity. She thought about her father lying in the house behind her, thought about the empty medicine bottles, thought about her own stubborn pride and whether it was worth her father's life. I would need to be able to spend time with him each day, she said slowly, to care for him properly. Of course, Peter said. Your duties would be flexible around his needs. And this is a real job, not charity dressed up as kindness. I genuinely need a housekeeper, Peter said. You can ask any of my ranch hands, the house is a wreck, but I will not lie to you, Sarah. I am offering the job to you specifically because I know you need it and because I have the means to help. If that makes you uncomfortable, I understand. Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. When would you want us to move? Whenever is convenient for you, Peter said. Today, tomorrow, next week. I can have some of my men come help move your things. Tomorrow, Sarah said. We will come tomorrow. Peter's face broke into a smile, and Sarah realized it was the first time she had seen him smile. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less careworn. Tomorrow, then, he said, I will have the cottage ready. He helped her unload the supplies from the mule, staples like flour and coffee and beans, and he did not comment when she saw that he had included 2 bottles of her father's medicine. When she tried to thank him, he just shook his head and rode away, leaving her standing in the yard with tears streaming down her face. The move happened quickly. Peter sent 3 of his ranch hands with a wagon, and they loaded up the few pieces of furniture and belongings the Dawsons had left. Sarah's father was weak but alert enough to understand what was happening, and he did not protest. He knew as well as she did that they had run out of options. The Turner Ranch, which Peter still called by his uncle's name out of habit and respect, was a sprawling operation with a main house, several barns, a bunkhouse for the hands, and various outbuildings. The cottage Peter had mentioned sat about 50 yards from the main house, a neat adobe structure with a red tile roof and a small covered porch. Inside, it was simple but clean, with a bedroom, a main room with a fireplace, and even a small kitchen area. Sarah's father settled into the bedroom, and she could see the relief on his face at having a real bed again with clean sheets and a soft pillow. She administered his medicine and sat with him until he fell asleep, then walked up to the main house to report for her first day of work. Peter had not been exaggerating about the state of the house. The kitchen was a disaster of unwashed dishes and scattered cooking implements. Dust covered every surface in the front rooms. The office was a chaos of papers and ledgers. Sarah rolled up her sleeves and got to work, and by the end of the first day she had made a visible dent in the disorder. Peter came in at supper time, dusty and tired from working with the cattle. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and stared at the transformation. The dishes were washed and put away, the floor was swept, and something that smelled heavenly was simmering on the stove. "Is that actual food?" he asked, and there was wonder in his voice. "It is beef stew," Sarah said, trying not to smile at his expression. "Nothing fancy, but it should be edible." "I have been living on burnt beans and jerky for a month," Peter said. "This is going to be fancy by comparison." They ate at the kitchen table, an oddly intimate arrangement that made Sarah feel self-conscious at first. But Peter had a way of making conversation easy, asking about her father's health and telling stories about the ranch and the hands. He had 12 men working for him, he explained, and they usually ate in the bunkhouse where one of them attempted cooking with varying degrees of success. "I thought maybe you could cook for all of us," Peter said. "I mean, if you are willing, I would pay you extra for that, another $10 a month. The men would appreciate having decent food, and it would be a big help." "That would be fine," Sarah said. "I am used to cooking for groups. We used to have ranch hands too before." She trailed off. "Before things got hard," Peter finished gently. "It happens to a lot of us out here. One bad year can wipe out decades of work. You have nothing to be ashamed of." Sarah looked down at her plate, blinking back unexpected tears. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such kindness and understanding. "Thank you," she managed to say. "You are welcome," Peter said. "And Sarah, I am glad you are here, truly." The days settled into a rhythm. Sarah woke early to prepare breakfast for Peter and the ranch hands, then spent her mornings cleaning and maintaining the main house. After lunch, she would spend several hours with her father, reading to him or just sitting by his bedside. The medicine was helping, and he seemed to be regaining a little strength. In the evenings, she prepared supper and then retreated to the cottage to sleep. Peter was a good employer, respectful and generous. He never asked her to do anything unreasonable, and he always treated her with courtesy. But Sarah began to notice small things. The way his eyes would find her across a room. How he always seemed to know when she needed help carrying something heavy. The fact that he had started coming in for lunch when he used to eat with the hands in the bunkhouse. She tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself she was imagining things. But then came the evening when she was finishing the dishes, and she heard a strange sound coming from outside. She dried her hands and walked to the door, peering out into the twilight. Peter was sitting on the porch steps with a guitar in his hands, playing a soft melody. He saw her and stopped, looking almost embarrassed. "I did not know you played," Sarah said, stepping out onto the porch. "My mother taught me before she died," Peter said. "I do not do it much anymore, but sometimes the mood strikes me." "It sounded beautiful," Sarah said. "Please do not stop on my account." Peter played a few more songs, old ballads and folk tunes, and Sarah sat on the top step and listened. The desert night was cool and the stars were beginning to emerge, scattered across the sky like diamonds on dark velvet. When Peter finished the last song, the silence that followed felt comfortable rather than awkward. "I should check on my father," Sarah said, standing up reluctantly. "Of course," Peter said. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night, Peter." As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself looking forward to those evening concerts, and Peter began to play more often. Sometimes they would talk, sharing stories about their childhoods or their dreams for the future. Other times they would sit in companionable silence, just enjoying each other's presence. Sarah's hair began to grow back, a soft fuzz at first, and then short curls that framed her face in a way that was almost charming. She caught Peter looking at her one day, and when their eyes met, he did not look away. "It suits you," he said quietly. "The short hair, it shows your face more." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "It is starting to grow back." "I know," Peter said. "But I hope you know that you were beautiful before and you are beautiful now. Hair has nothing to do with it." It was the first time he had said anything so personal, and Sarah did not know how to respond. She mumbled something and fled to the kitchen, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. That night, she lay awake in her bed in the cottage and forced herself to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She was developing feelings for Peter Barrett, feelings that went far beyond gratitude for his help or appreciation for his kindness. She thought about the way he smiled at her, the gentleness in his hands when he helped her father from bed to chair, the sound of his voice when he sang old songs in the evening light. But she was his employee, dependent on him for her father's medicine and their shelter. Any relationship between them would be complicated by that imbalance of power, and Sarah had too much pride to be the kind of woman who traded affection for security. She resolved to be more careful, to maintain proper boundaries and remember her place. Peter, however, seemed to have other ideas. He began finding excuses to be around her, helping her carry water or chop vegetables for supper. He brought her little gifts, nothing expensive or inappropriate, just a book he thought she might like or a pretty stone he had found on the range. He asked her opinion on ranch matters, listening seriously to her answers as though she were a partner rather than an employee. One afternoon, in late November, Sarah was in the kitchen preparing pies for Thanksgiving when Peter came in from the barn. He watched her work for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, her hands busy with the pie dough. "Why do you always pull away when we start to have a real conversation? Whenever things get personal, you find a reason to leave the room or change the subject." Sarah kept her eyes on the dough. "I do not know what you mean." "Yes, you do," Peter said gently. "You have been doing it for weeks now. Did I say something to offend you?" "If I have been inappropriate in any way, I apologize." "You have been nothing but kind," Sarah said, and she heard the strain in her own voice. "That is the problem. I do not understand." Sarah set down her rolling pin and turned to face him. "Peter, I am your employee. You pay for my father's medicine, you gave us a place to live, you have been incredibly generous. I cannot. I will not take advantage of that by letting myself feel things that would complicate the situation." Peter stared at her. "Complicate the situation?" "Sarah, I did not offer you this job just to be kind." "Well, I did, but that was not the only reason." "Then what was the reason?" "Because I wanted you here," Peter said simply. "Because I remembered a brave little girl who stood up to bullies, and I wanted to know what kind of woman she had become. Because when I saw you on that road with your beautiful hair gone and your chin held high, I thought you were the most magnificent thing I had ever seen. Because I have been half in love with you since you moved into the cottage, and I was just waiting for the right time to tell you." Sarah felt as though all the air had left the room. "You? What?" "I am in love with you," Peter said, and he stepped closer. "I know the circumstances are not ideal, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I could not let you think that my kindness was just charity or obligation. Everything I have done, I did because I wanted to, because helping you made me happy." "I do not know what to say," Sarah whispered. "You do not have to say anything right now," Peter said. "Just think about it. And Sarah, if you do not feel the same way, that is all right. Your job is not contingent on your feelings. You and your father will always have a place here, no matter what." He left before she could respond, and Sarah stood alone in the kitchen with flour on her hands and her heart racing. She tried to return to the pies, but her hands were shaking too badly. She finally gave up and went to sit with her father, who was having one of his good days and was sitting in a chair by the window. "You look troubled," he said, studying her face. "What is wrong?" Sarah told him everything, the words spilling out in a rush. Her father listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You love him?" he asked finally. "I think I do," Sarah admitted. "But Papa, what if he only thinks he loves me because he feels sorry for me? What if I am just some kind of charity project that he has romanticized? From what you have told me, Peter Barrett does not seem like the kind of man who does anything out of pity," her father said. "And you, my dear girl, are not the kind of woman who inspires pity. You inspire admiration, respect, and yes, love. If he says he loves you, perhaps you should believe him." "But the situation is so complicated," Sarah said. "Life is complicated," her father said simply. "Love does not wait for perfect circumstances. It arrives when it arrives, and we have to decide whether to embrace it or turn away from it." You have spent so much time being strong and independent, Sarah. Maybe it is time to let yourself be vulnerable enough to accept what is being offered." Sarah thought about his words all through that evening and into the night. The next morning was Thanksgiving, and she prepared a feast for Peter and the ranch hands. The table was laden with roasted turkey, corn pudding, biscuits, gravy, and 3 kinds of pie. The men ate with appreciation and enthusiasm, offering compliments and thanks. After everyone had left, Peter helped Sarah clean up the dishes. They worked side by side in silence for a while, and then Sarah took a deep breath and spoke. "I love you too," she said, not looking at him. "I've been trying not to, but I do." She heard Peter set down the dish he was drying, then his hands were on her shoulders, gently turning her to face him. His eyes searched her face, and whatever he saw there made him smile. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. "Yes," Sarah whispered. The kiss was soft and sweet, tasting of apple pie and promise. When they pulled apart, Peter rested his forehead against hers and let out a long breath. "I have been wanting to do that for weeks," he said. "So have I," Sarah admitted. They courted properly after that, with all the rituals and proprieties that frontier life allowed. Peter took Sarah on picnics in the desert, spreading a blanket near a creek bed and sharing sandwiches while lizards darted through the rocks. He brought her flowers, tough desert blooms that survived in the harsh climate. He asked her father's permission to court her formally, and her father gave his blessing with tears in his eyes. Sarah's father continued to improve slowly. The regular medicine and good food were helping, and so was the happiness he saw in his daughter's face. He grew strong enough to sit on the cottage porch for hours at a time, watching the life of the ranch unfold around him. In February of 1883, Peter took Sarah to Gila Bend to see a traveling theater troupe that was performing at the town hall. After the show, as they walked through the quiet streets under the stars, Peter stopped and took both her hands in his. "Sarah Dawson, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person," he said. "You are strong and brave and kind, and you make every day better just by being in it. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Peter, I will marry you." They were married in April in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Sarah's father giving her away and the ranch hands serving as witnesses. Dr. Morrison attended, smiling at the sight of his patient healthy enough to walk his daughter down the aisle. Sarah wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue calico, and Peter wore his best suit. Someone had brought a camera, and they posed for a photograph. Sarah's short curls just visible beneath her bonnet, Peter's arm around her waist, both of them grinning like fools. They moved into the main house together, and Sarah's father stayed in the cottage with a nurse Peter hired to help care for him during the day. The old man thrived in the clear air and peaceful surroundings, and there were days when he was strong enough to walk around the property with a cane, inspecting the horses and offering advice to the younger ranch hands who listened with respect. Sarah discovered that she loved being married to Peter, loved the intimacy of sharing a bed and a life, loved the way he would sneak up behind her while she was cooking to steal a kiss. She loved running the household and managing the domestic side of the ranch, bringing order and comfort to a place that had been all masculine efficiency before. In the summer of 1883, Sarah realized she was pregnant. Peter was overjoyed, and so was her father when they told him the news. The pregnancy was easy, and Sarah continued her work around the ranch until the very last weeks, when Peter finally insisted she rest more. Their son was born in March of 1884, a healthy baby with dark hair and strong lungs. They named him Thomas, after Peter's father. Sarah's father held his grandson with tears streaming down his weathered face, and he whispered that he could die happy now, knowing his daughter and her child would be cared for. "You are not allowed to die yet," Sarah told him firmly. "Thomas needs to know his grandfather." Her father lived for 3 more years, long enough to teach Thomas how to whistle and to tell him stories about the old days. He died peacefully in his sleep in the summer of 1887, and they buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple marker that read, "Jacob Dawson, beloved father and grandfather." Sarah mourned him deeply, but she found comfort in Peter's arms and in the presence of their son. She would stand at the kitchen window sometimes, watching Thomas play in the yard, and she would think about the day she had sold her hair. It seemed like a lifetime ago, that desperate girl with nothing left to sell but her own body's adornments. She had been so afraid then, so certain that the future held nothing but loss and pain. But she had been wrong. That act of sacrifice had led her here, to this life she had never imagined. She had a husband who loved her, a son who filled her days with joy, a home that was truly hers. Her hair had grown back, falling in waves to her shoulders now, and sometimes Peter would run his fingers through it and marvel at how soft it was. "You know," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I am glad you sold your hair that day." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Why would you say that?" "Because if you had not, you might never have needed to come here," Peter said. "I might never have had the chance to tell you how I felt. Sometimes the hardest moments lead us exactly where we need to be." Sarah thought about that, and she realized he was right. She had mourned the loss of her hair, had felt diminished and ashamed. But it had grown back, just as she had told her father it would. What had not grown back was the pride that had nearly kept her from accepting help, the fear that had nearly prevented her from admitting her feelings. In 1888, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Rose. Then came another son in 1890, whom they called Henry. The ranch prospered, and Peter bought more land, expanding the operation until it was one of the largest in the territory. Sarah ran the household with skill and efficiency, but she also became Peter's partner in the business decisions, offering insights that often proved valuable. The ranch hands respected her, and so did the other ranchers in the area. When Arizona became a state years later, Sarah was active in the women's suffrage movement, writing letters and organizing meetings. Peter supported her fully, proud of his wife's intelligence and passion. As the years passed and their children grew, Sarah and Peter would sometimes talk about those early days, about the circumstances that had brought them together. Thomas, their eldest, loved the story of how his mother had sacrificed her hair for his grandfather's medicine, and how his father had then made sure she never had to make such a sacrifice again. "So you bought her medicine from then on?" Thomas asked one night when he was 10 years old. "Every month until your grandfather died," Peter confirmed. "And I would have kept buying it for as long as he needed it, because your mother was the bravest person I had ever met, and I wanted to make her life easier in whatever way I could." "That is very romantic," Rose said with the dramatic flair of a 7-year-old girl who had been reading too many story books. "It was not romantic at first," Sarah said, smiling at the memory. "It was awkward and complicated, and I was too proud to accept help gracefully. But your father was patient with me, and eventually I learned that accepting help is not the same as being weak." "Tell us about when Papa proposed," Rose begged, and Sarah and Peter exchanged a glance, both of them smiling. They told the story again, even though the children had heard it dozens of times. They told about the theater troupe and the starlit walk through Gila Bend, and the moment when Peter had dropped to one knee in the dusty street. They told about the wedding and the photograph, and the way Sarah's father had cried tears of joy. The The children listened with rapt attention, as they always did, because even though they had heard the story before, it never got old. It was the story of how their family began, the story of sacrifice and love and second chances. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Peter gave Sarah a gift wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. She opened it to find a small velvet box, and inside was a locket on a gold chain. When she opened the locket, she found 2 tiny braids of hair inside, one honey-colored and one dark brown. "Where did you get these?" she asked, her voice catching. "The honey-colored one I bought from Henderson at the general store all those years ago," Peter said. "I asked him to save me a lock before he sent the rest to San Francisco. The dark one is from my own hair, from when my mother cut it before she died. I thought we could keep them together, a reminder of where we came from and what we survived." Sarah closed her hand around the locket and pulled Peter close, kissing him with all the love and gratitude she felt. 20 years of marriage, and he could still surprise her with his thoughtfulness and his deep understanding of what mattered. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I have loved you since that first Thanksgiving when I finally admitted it to myself, and I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you," Peter said. "From the moment I saw you on that road, brave and shorn and magnificent, until the end of time itself." They held each other as the Arizona sun set outside their window, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch hummed with life around them, their children playing somewhere nearby, the cattle lowing in the distance, the ranch hands finishing their evening chores. Sarah thought about the girl she had been, desperate and afraid, with nothing left to sell but her hair. She thought about the woman she had become, strong and loved and whole. The journey between those 2 versions of herself had been difficult, marked by loss and hardship and moments of despair. But it had also been marked by love, by a man who had seen her at her lowest moment and had offered not pity but partnership. Peter had bought her father's medicine month after month, asking nothing in return except the chance to know her better. He had courted her patiently, married her joyfully, and built a life with her that exceeded anything she had dared to dream. As the years continued to roll by, Sarah and Peter grew old together the way all couples hope to. Their children married and had children of their own, filling the ranch with new generations of laughter and life. The little cottage where Sarah and her father had first lived became a place for visiting family members, and eventually for Sarah and Peter themselves when they decided the main house should go to Thomas and his young bride. On quiet evenings, Peter would still play his guitar on the porch, and Sarah would sit beside him with her knitting or a book, content in the comfortable silence of 2 people who knew each other completely. Her hair, which had grown back thicker and more beautiful than before, had gone silver with age, and Peter's dark curls had faded to gray. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been that spring day in 1883, standing in a ranch yard and promising to love each other forever. Time had changed their faces and their bodies, but it had not touched the essential truth of what they had built together. Sarah never regretted selling her hair. It had been the catalyst that brought her to this life, to this man, to this family. In the quiet moments before sleep, she would touch the locket Peter had given her all those years ago, feeling the small braids of hair inside, and she would give thanks for the desperation that had forced her to make such a sacrifice. Because that sacrifice had led to everything good in her life. It had led to Peter riding into her yard with supplies and a job offer. It had led to evening concerts and stolen kisses and a proposal under the stars. It had led to children and grandchildren and a legacy that would outlast them both. When Sarah was 70 years old, sitting on the porch of the cottage with Peter's hand in hers, and the Arizona desert stretching out before them in all its harsh beauty. She finally understood what her father had meant all those years ago, when he told her that love does not wait for perfect circumstances. Love had found her in the midst of crisis, had lifted her up when she was at her lowest, had given her a reason to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. And she had been brave enough to accept it, to let go of her pride and her fear and simply receive what was being offered. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, passed down through the generations they had created. The story of the woman who sold her hair and the cowboy who bought her medicine would be told and retold, becoming part of the family mythology. A reminder that even in the hardest times, love can find a way. Sarah died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73, with Peter holding her hand and their children gathered around her bed. Peter followed her 6 months later, unable to imagine a world without his beloved wife in it. They were buried side by side on the hill next to Sarah's father, overlooking the land they had built their life upon. The locket Sarah had worn every day for decades was passed down to Rose, who gave it to her own daughter, who gave it to hers. The little braids of hair inside remained perfectly preserved, a tangible reminder of where the family story began, with a desperate act of love and a cowboy who saw beauty in sacrifice. And in the telling and retelling of that story through the generations, one truth remained constant. Sarah had sold every lock of hair she had to save her father, and Peter had bought her medicine from then on, not because she needed charity, but because she deserved a partner, someone who would stand beside her and help carry the burden. In doing so, he had won her heart and built a love story that would echo through time, a testament to the power of sacrifice, compassion, and the courage to accept help when it is offered in the spirit of genuine love.